let me tell you something. You have no idea what tyranny feels like. If not, ask those who fled the Soviet Union. Ask the exiles from Cuba, from North Korea, from Iran. Ask anyone who risked everything to escape a regime that crushed the truth and punished the thought. Welcome behind the veil. In the landscape, we think. In stillness, we converse. But the real danger isn't on the page. It's in the boardrooms, on campuses, and inside policy meetings, where standards are quietly eroded in the name of fairness, and identity begins to outrank competence. That's where we left off. Today, let's step back and ask a deeper question. Why did a book like this, logically seen but emotionally powerful, receive so much praise? Here are the facts. The Tyranny of Marriage was a bestseller. It was praised by the New York Times, The Guardian, and other major outlets. It was named one of the books of the year. On Amazon and Google Books, it holds high ratings. It was nominated for awards in politics, philosophy, and ethics. So, does that mean it's good? No, not necessarily. Being a bestseller doesn't mean a book is right. It means it struck the right emotional chord, and the right cultural moment, and right around that moment, from the late 2010s into early 2020s. Elite institutions were undergoing a shift. A new moral vocabulary began to dominate. Diversity, equity, inclusion. This wasn't just symbolic. It translated into policy. In 2021, the Biden administration issued Executive Order 13,985, mandating all federal agencies to embed equity assessments into every major decision-making process. Medical schools like UCSF and Columbia rewrote their admissions rubrics, explicitly rewarding identity makers, sometimes as much as academic achievement. The National Institutes of Health launched the Unite initiative, rerouting scientific funding based on demographic equity. And in June 2020, Harvard announced it would prize out standardized tests, citing their role in perpetuating educational inequity. The logic was simple. If outcomes weren't equal, the system must be discriminatory, even if no explicit bias could be found. But here's the catch. This shift didn't happen through public debate. It happened through committees, HR directives, and internal memos. It was bureaucratic, not democratic. And it brought with it something deeper. A change in what counted as a moral authority. Reason and evidence gave way to emotion, identity, and lived experience. And from that point forward, questioning the framework wasn't seen as a critique. It wasn't seen as harm. This is where Sandel's book fit in, not as the cause, but as a resonance. His moralized critique of meritocracy aligns perfectly with institutions replacing performance-based evaluation with identity-centered metrics. He didn't create the movement, but his language about the tyranny of success, the hubris of the credentials, the need for humility, gave it a philosophical cover. It turned a political pivot into a moral imperative. But this matters more than you might think. Because language is not just a tool for expression, it's the programming language of the brain. The way we describe the world becomes the way we perceive it. And if you feed someone a closed-loop moral story, it's passionate, while their critical judgment is still forming, what happens? You don't just shape their values, you install emotional antibodies against alternatives. They don't argue, they flinch. Disagreement feels like an offense. Correction feels like an attack. This isn't just a philosophical concern, it's a psychological one. And so many young people today are caught inside that loop. They read books like The Tyranny of Marriage or any material built on the same logic, where critical thinking quietly shifts from examining ideas to agreeing with the emotional tone of the author. When a book tells them that success is never earned, that inequality is a wound, that judgment is cruelty, it doesn't offer analysis, it offers relief. Relief from responsibility, relief from self-doubt, relief from the burden of having to improve, to compete, to be judged. That's why it resonated. Because for a generation shaped by algorithmic affirmation and ideological conformity masked as care, relief feels like truth. They're not just victims of bad ideas, they're victims of institutions that claim to empower them, while quietly training them to distract dissent. Whether it's in media, academia, or corporate messaging, the new rule is the same. If someone says they're doing good for you or for society, you'd better ask, by whose definition of good, and at what cost? Because when the same moral vocabulary is repeated over and over, equity, fairness, inclusion, but never defined with clarity or consistency, what's left isn't thought, it's programming. And that brings us to the next layer of this story, the vocabulary of confusion. Because sometimes the most effective way to hide a bad idea is to wrap it in a good-sounding word. Let's start with the words themselves. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. U.S. Declaration of Independence. Equality means something specific. Equal rights under the law, equal treatment. It's the foundation of liberal democracy. But now, we're told that equality isn't enough. We need something new. Equity. What does that mean? Equity means equal outcomes, not equal opportunities. It demands that every group end up with the same results, regardless of process, effort, skill, or choice. But if different people make different decisions and have different talents, then forcing equal outcomes means punishing some and rewarding others arbitrarily. That's not justice, that's manipulation. Then we hear about social justice, but justice is already justice. We can debate whether a law or a policy is just, but what exactly is social justice? In most cases, it means redefining justice through the lens of group identity instead of individual action. Worse still, we get phrases like climate justice, as if weather patterns now carry moral weight, or hate speech, which sounds dangerous until you realize hate is an emotion, speech is expression. So now, we are criminalizing emotions if they offend someone? Or on what planet is that a maximum freedom society? These slogans aren't just annoying, they're dangerous. Because once people accept emotional loaded phrases without clear definitions, they stop asking the hard questions, they stop thinking. And the institutions have learned to weaponize this. under banners like DEI, inclusion, or anti-racism. Many universities and corporations are enforcing policies that discard competence in favor of optics. This is the deeper danger of moral language without rigor, because every ideology, good or bad, relies on vocabulary. But when that vocabulary becomes vague, sentimental, or secular, it stops clarifying the world. It starts clouding it. And this is where thinkers like Michael Sandel, consciously or not, make the problem worse. Instead of shaping the meaning of these terms, he embeds them in moral narratives that feel true, without requiring precision. He tells a story in which humility means not defending your success, fairness means leveling outcomes, and inclusion means avoiding judgment entirely. It's a story with heroes and villains, but no structure, no trade-offs, no definitions you can challenge. And if you disagree, you are not seen as reasoning from different principles. You are seen as defending cruelty, or privilege, or arrogance. In this kind of a culture, words no longer point to reality, they point to allegiance. So when someone uses these terms, fairness, equity, inclusion, you are not debating ideas, you are singling virtue or demanding submission. That's not how language should work. Language is supposed to clarify meaning, not obscure it. And when language breaks down, something more dangerous takes its place: moral confusion. So, how did we get here? How did slogans replace standards? How did feeling morally good become more important than doing what actually works? It didn't happen all at once. It happened through a loop. And once you see the pattern, you can't unsee it. Step 1. Emotional language reframes the debate. Words like equity, lived experience, harm, and hate speech aren't just descriptive. They're loaded. They don't just label things, they reframe them. Disagreement becomes danger. Debate becomes oppression. Moral judgment is recoded as personal cruelty. Truth gets replaced by impact. And the question subtly shifts from "is this right?" to "who might feel hurt by this?" This emotional framing hijacks our moral instincts, and it lays the groundwork for the next step. Step 2. Institutions and media amplify it. The media doesn't reward accuracy, it rewards outrage. A complex idea? It dies in the algorithm. But a moral story, clean, emotional, urgent, spreads like wildfire. Grievance travels faster than nuance. So headlines prioritize hurt over data, identity over evidence, and institutions follow the mood, not the facts. Universities rewrite mission statements. Corporations flood HR with slogans. Everyone speaks the new language, not because it makes sense, but because it's safer. Hiring panels, faculty meetings, boardrooms, classrooms, they all start to sound the same. Step 3. Dissent becomes dangerous. This is where the loop locks in. Because the moment someone raises a hand and says, "Wait, shouldn't we still care about competence or accuracy?" They're branded insensitive, outdated, privileged, or worse. Even if their concern is thoughtful, even if it's backed by facts, it doesn't matter. They've broken the spell. So people get quiet, questions go unasked, conversations move underground, and bad ideas go unchallenged, not because they're true, but because they're protected. Then the cycle repeats. More emotional framing, more institutional compliance, more silence from people who know better. This is how sentiment becomes a structure. Not through conspiracy, but through cowardice. Not through ideology, but through emotional blackmail. It's not that we became less capable of thinking. It's that we became more afraid of being seen as cruel. And that's how slogans take power. They offer emotional comfort while dismantling critical judgment. So what happens when emotional language becomes policy? When slogans govern institutions, when the question is no longer what works, but what feels fear. Here is what happens. Harvard. When the brightest lose sight of the basics. Harvard is supposed to be the pinnacle of American education. But what if the very top is rotting and quietly exporting that decay to the rest of the system? We already know how Harvard discriminated against Asian American applicants. In the name of equity, while preaching justice in public, they taught generations that merit is unfair, objectivity is oppressive, and outcomes matter more than standards. But that's just the surface. Because across America, education has been hollowed out by emotional ideology. Many college students today can no longer say what a man or a woman is, not because the science changed, but because they were taught that even asking the question is a form of violence. Thousands of young people now undergo irreversible surgeries, often pushed by institutions that equate affirmation with care. This isn't freedom, it's a failure of critical thinking, masked as compassion. Let's be clear, the world isn't laughing at transgender individuals. They're not the punchline, they're the victims. The world is laughing at America's elite education system, a system that sacrifices clarity for inclusion and causes confusing progress. And at the center of this irony, Harvard itself, the same institution that once offered the world's most famous course on justice, is now led by a president who is suing the federal government under the banner of academic freedom. Once again, justice is redefined to mean whatever benefits my tribe, and freedom becomes the right to discriminate, as long as you do it with good intentions. That's not education, that's moral confusion in a cap and a gown. Example 2. Boeing, diversity over engineering. For decades, Boeing stood for precision, engineering, and safety. Then priorities changed. Diversity training began to replace technical training. Leadership shifted focus from engineering excellence to inclusion metrics. Hiring and promotion began to favor identity alignment over actual competence. And the result, 2 Boeing 737 MAX jets crashed, killing 346 people. Even as I finish writing these words, another warning appears in the news. A Boeing 787 has just crashed in India. The investigation is still ongoing. Investigations revealed internal concerns had been ignored. Engineers were sidelined. Warnings went unheeded. This wasn't a PR crisis. It was a mass casualty event. When emotion governs policy and optics override feedback, planes fall from the sky. This isn't a metaphor, it's a body count. Example number 3. California Fire Department playing with fire. California Fire Departments too were reshaped by DEI ideology. Written exams were downplayed, physical standards were relaxed in the name of equity. What was once a job of raw risk and resilience became a taste of ideological compliance. But when white fires come, And they always do in California. The flames don't care about your gender studies degree. They don't care if your department is diverse. They care if you can lift a hose, scale a wall, survive the heat, and save a life. Lowering the bar doesn't just risk the firefighter, it risks the town in the name of inclusion. We've redefined readiness, but nature doesn't negotiate with feelings. Example number 4. In Noise, a Flaw in Human Judgment, Daniel Kahneman and co-authors document a quieter but equally devastating failure of moral reasoning. In 2005, the US Supreme Court struck down mandatory sentencing guidelines. The goal? More nuance, more humanity, more justice. But that's not what happened. Instead, sentencing became widely inconsistent, what Kahneman calls noise. Same crime, same facts, yet vastly different outcomes depending on the judge's mood, politics, or identity assumptions. And tragically, the disparities worsened. After 2005, Black Americans began receiving longer sentences than whites for the same crimes, undoing decades of hard-won consistency. What was sold as fairness became chaos. What was meant to reduce bias reintroduced it through the back door of emotion. We replaced principle with feeling and called justice. Example number 4. And the pattern isn't new. In 1970s France, a wave of sexual liberation swept the country. Activists called for the end of repression. They championed self-expression, bodily autonomy, and freedom. For a time, it felt righteous. But something was lost in the noise: judgment. Some radicals went further, challenging even age of consent laws in the name of liberty. Institutions were too caught up in moral fervor to intervene. And while culture celebrated liberation, another wave was forming quietly: HIV. By the early 1980s, France faced one of the worst AIDS epidemics in Europe. Communities that had fought for freedom now struggled to pivot toward caution. Restraint felt like a betrayal. Precaution felt like oppression. No, liberation didn't cause HIV, but it created a climate where emotion overrode prudence, where moral narratives blinded people to systemic risk, where feeling right delayed being wise. History doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. From Harvard to Boeing, from courtrooms to wildfires, from 1970s France to today's campuses, I have countless examples to show you. The pattern is clear. Sentiment replaces judgment, narratives replaces standards, and people suffer. Not because anyone planned it, but because once emotion takes the wheel, institutions lose their brakes. We don't need a grand conspiracy, only eyes clear enough to see the loop, where cowardice wears the mask of compassion. Hypocrisy drapes itself in the robe of kindness, and confusion parades as progress. A quiet reversal of virtue, where sentiment is crowned as justice, and discernment condemned as cruelty. These aren't scattered missteps, they are signals, patterns, symptoms of a deeper rot. Each example, whether it's universities silencing dissent, fire departments lowering standards, or policies wrapped in compassion but rooted in control, they're not accidents, they're outcomes. Outcomes of a system that rewards emotion over evaluation and punishes judgment in the name of kindness. We don't need a conspiracy theory to explain this. We just need to recognize the feedback loop, where cowardice hides behind compassion and confusion is sold as progress, where entire worldviews dress up sentiment as justice and call dependency care. Meanwhile, liberty and justice are quietly eroded, not through brute force, but through soft coercion. Politicians say they're helping the poor and the marginalized, but what they're really doing is spending taxpayers' money to buy emotional currency, votes, virtue, control. This is not a generosity, it's a trade. Citizens exchange dignity for dependency, freedom for fleeting comfort, and like all bad trades, it forms a corrosive loop. Because if handouts replace ambition, why study? Why work? Why build a future? And when the state fails to deliver what it once promised, frustration doesn't turn inward, it lashes out. People riot, loot, destroy. We've seen it again and again in California, in New York, in once great cities, now unraveling under the weight of unaccountable compassion. Take the Black community, a group too often spoken for, but rarely listened to. They were promised uplift. What they got was decades of dependency, not opportunity, but bureaucracy, not dignity, but emotional shelter. And systems like this, built on performers, are designed to resist scrutiny. Why? Because emotion disables inquiry, and when a lie generates power, its beneficiaries will do anything to prevent its exposure. In the end, no one escapes the damage. The poor stay poor, the marginalized stay managed, the taxpayers are drained until they collapse, and the politicians, they too become prisoners, addicted to power, performing virtue by day, haunted by guilt at night, their souls eroded, their judgments hollow, their legacy a stage where everyone must act, and no one is free to think. This is not a cycle of justice, it's a loop of decay. The real question isn't what feels fair, it's what's true, what works, what endures. Because real justice doesn't perform, it builds, it lasts. We often treat freedom as a given, but freedom is never automatic. It must be protected, cultivated, defended, especially by those raised to take it for granted. The founders understood this. They weren't idealists chasing utopia. They were realists, shaped by history and by worry of power. Drawing from John Locke, Roman republicanism, and British constitutionalism, they built a system designed to endure disagreement, diversity, dissent, because they understood a deeper truth. Freedom is not the absence of oppression. It's the presence of a system strong enough to prevent its own decay. And the decay doesn't always begin with tanks or tyrants. Sometimes it begins quietly in a classroom, behind a podium, inside a vote. When education collapses, when speech is strangled in the name of safety, when universities trade inquiry for ideology, when a society sells its soul one bargain at a time, votes for handouts, dignity for dependency, truth for tribal power, integrity for applause, then the foundation doesn't just weaken, it erodes. And freedom, once again for granted, begins to slip beneath the surface, not with a scream, but with a shrug. Universities were meant to be firewalls of civilization, but many now function as factories of cultural control, engines of cancellation, compliance, and career risk, cowardice. no defenders of free thought, but regulators of it. This is not liberty, it's the illusion of liberty weaponized against it itself. And this is what the founders feared most. They understood that power doesn't just corrupt the strong, it seduces the self-righteous. That laws must restrain not just kings, but mobs, not just violence, but sentiment. They built firewalls, checks and balances, federalism, free speech even when it offends. A republic not ruled by feelings, but by structure. Code? Perhaps. But code is how we preserve fire. Because when rights depend on feelings and laws are rewritten by moral fashion, we don't get justice, we get pendulum justice, always swinging, never stable. And here's the final irony. The very groups emotional policies claim to protect often suffer most when the structure collapses. That's the wisdom we've forgotten, that real liberty is fragile, that compassion is not enough, and that only a system grounded in restraint, reason, and rigor can keep freedom from turning against itself. And we need constant reminders, not just to recall the wisdom of the past, but to remain vigilant in the present. Friedrich Hayek warned about this in The Road to Serfdom. He said that when governments chase what they call collective happiness, they often end up paving the way to tyranny. Ronald Reagan put it simply and memorably. The most terrifying words in English language are, "I'm from the government, and I'm here to help." Because when we forget the freedom comes with a cost, we start trading it bit by bit for comfort, for applause, for a false sense of safety. What we are seeing now isn't a progress, it's a hollowing out. A culture that swaps merit for identity, real inquiry for slogans, and lasting truth for the latest trend. That's not growth, it's a decay from the inside. If we really care about freedom, real freedom, not just the show, we have to stand up for it, not just against outside streets, but against the rot that can take hold from within. Like Reagan warned us, freedom is never more than one generation away from extinction. Finally, for this episode, let me be clear. I'm not against the emotion, but I prefer emotions that elevate the human spirit, courage, perseverance, responsibility, self-respect. I grew up with nothing. I went to my elementary school barefoot across all 4 seasons. I once complained, but I chose to learn, to grow, to fight. And what you call social justice, what you call compassion for someone like me, politely speaking, it means nothing to me. Truthfully speaking, it insults me. I'm a free man. My only wealth is my dreams. Your so-called welfare, your moral gesture, as I see, is just a way of trying to rob me of the freedom to chase them on my own terms. Those obstacles you cry over, they were my training. They built my resilience, my empathy, my strength, and most importantly, they taught me how to love. And love, real love, obeys procedural justice. Love respects freedom. Love is unconditional. You take taxpayers' money, hand it to me, and call that love? You call that justice? And then, with no sense of shame, you call marriage a form of tyranny. Let me tell you something. You have no idea what tyranny feels like. If not, Ask those who fled the Soviet Union. Ask the exiles from Cuba, from North Korea, from Iran. Ask anyone who risked everything to escape a regime that crushed the truth and punished the thought. Because human beings don't just learn through language, we learn through pain, through memory, through the body itself. The brain remembers what fear feels like. It remembers the paralysis of powerlessness, the dull ache of losing agency, the slow erosion of self-motivation when every choice is taken from you. It knows when freedom is missing, even before the mouth finds the words. And that's why, when I read your book, my instinct screamed, something is wrong here. Something dark is coming, wrapped in sentiment, disguised as compassion. So no, I don't need your shallow sympathy. As Charlotte Katakuri once said, when men face off, hollow sympathy has no place.